Okay, so I'm going to need you to help me out. I am not a finance person, but one of the things as middle managers you all need to be able to do is step in and jump in when needed. And ultimately, if you're a manager, you manage resources, not just human resources, but financial resources. So we should all know how to deal with strategy and how to deal with finance matters. So I'm going to take you through that today. It is not going to be anywhere close to what your previous speaker would have done because she's a doctor. And I'm going to keep it simple because that's my motto for doing things, is keeping it simple. Okay? All right, so overview. We're going to go through why do we need to plan, the planning and budgeting process, what is strategic planning, and the link between policy planning and budgeting, and then the alignment. All right? The slides aren't pretty, but you're going to get some content, I hope, today. All right? I lost it. Okay, good. All right. So why plan? Effectively, your strategic plan is a roadmap. All right? It allows you to think through what you're going to do going forward, so for the following years. It helps you fit with the policy priorities. Any of you work in government, that's particularly important, to fit the policy priorities of ministers and the thing we talked about in terms of execution. If you're in a corporate private sector, then it helps you to ensure that your corporate strategic intent is walked out. It's also a way of how you can demonstrate success, because ultimately you need to know what it looks like, and your strategy should have key performance indicators attached to it. It will also help you to cost what it takes to achieve the strategy. And so that's where the alignment of the budget comes in, okay? Because we can't move forward and make decisions, informed decisions about what we want to do or what strategies we want to do if we don't know how much it's going to cost us to implement them, all right? It also demonstrates accountability. And again, if you are in the public service, that's really critical. We talk about good governance, and one of the key tenets of good governance is transparency and the public being able to know and hold you accountable. But that's also the same these days for corporates, because we talk about corporate social responsibility, and so your consumers also want to know that you're held accountable. And then one of the things that we need to remember is that without a plan, there is no direction, there's no prioritization, and no accountability. So that's really what we're aiming at, right? So this is just a simple model for stages of the planning and budgeting process. I think it's quite useful because it kind of gives us a starting point and helps us to see what the phases are that we go through. So the first part is the formulation, okay, of your plan. So that's the development. The second part is the approval of the plan, and you may have different mechanisms in terms of your strategic planning process. You may have the executives that do a retreat, then setting the big strategic goals that then cascade those down to you as middle managers, and therefore you may then have to do some modification. Good strategic planning should be both top down and bottom up. So if you get a set of strategic intents or themes or goals from your executive, then you're the people at the coalface who know whether this can get done. And so there should be some process that allows you to review those, filter that back up, and then eventually for the executive to approve it. If there's not, that's one of the things that perhaps, again, we talked about being bold and taking a step that you might want to think about suggesting. Then there's the implementation, that's execution, and any adjustment, because we can plan, but lots of contingencies will come through, and so we need to be able to change and adapt as we go along. Then there's the oversight piece, which is reviewing the plan, and we don't wait till the end of the year to review the plan. We often have a strategic planning retreat that might be annual, but there should be periods within that year that you are reviewing your plan and seeing if you're on course, and if you're not, taking steps to remedy that and make sure that you keep tracking and are heading in the direction of what you intended to achieve. So, what is strategic planning? Again, I like to keep it simple, but this is the strategic plan hierarchy. And what you'll see is that your mission, which is why we exist or our purpose, the vision, where we want to be, so what's the dream, what's the thing that we're seeking to achieve, the values, what we believe in, and not only are they what we believe in, but they're also about expectations. They tell you in the company how you expect to behave, and they tell your clients or customers what they can expect from you also. Then you have your strategic goals. So that's what you have to achieve to get where you want to in terms of realizing the mission and vision. Your objectives, which are the very specific outcomes. Your action plans, which is where you're going to put your key strategies of how you're going to actually work these things out. And then your performance indicators. All right, so this is how we're going to measure. So remember, if we took the previous slide, when we talked about oversight, that's what your key performance indicators are going to help you do. Again, in essence, strategy answers 3 questions. Where are we now? Where do we want to get to? And how do we get there? So I have a question for you. How many of you take part in strategic planning at the moment? A couple of you, okay. All right. Those of you that do, how do you determine where you are now? Speak up. Great. SWOT analysis, doing a PESTLE, doing assessments of where you are. Those are key tools that we use in strategy to be able to determine where we are now. We also may do a competitor analysis, 5 forces, Porter's 5 forces, those kinds of things. These tools are really useful in terms of being able to help us assess both at the macro level, yeah, what's happening outside in our industry, keeping up to date with trends, knowing who we're chasing, who we're behind, that kind of thing. But also, it helps us look at the macro level, the micro level. So internally, the SWOT looks at what are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And one of the interesting things about how strategy has developed recently is that we used to pay a lot of focus on looking at where we are now so that we could, if we're lagging behind, so we're not the lead in the industry, thinking about how we can catch up. What there is a lot more emphasis on now is how we can actually look at ourselves and differentiate ourselves so that most of our focus is not reactive. Because strategy is supposed to be future-centered and planning, for the future and looking at trends and seeing what value. We talked earlier about having a stagnating economy, and the only way to achieve growth is if we're going to add value, is value creation. So if all you're doing is looking at how you can catch up with your competitors, then you're not likely to add value to your customers. You're going to be doing the same things as your competitors, just trying to chase their tail. So bear that in mind whilst you're using these tools in terms of trying to determine where are we now. The idea is just to get an assessment of where the market is and get to know what your customers' needs and wants are. All right? That should really be the essence of the focus rather than on your competitors. All right. So where do we want to get to? We need to be able to articulate where we want to get to. For most of you, that will have been done because we just talked about the hierarchy, and you'll have a mission and a vision, all right? So the mission says what your purpose is. Your vision will be, what dream is it you want to achieve? Whether you want to be the market leader, whatever it is. That's really setting the goalposts for you in terms of determining where you want to get to. And then the third question is, how do we get there? That's what your strategy is about, and where you as middle managers should have a lot of input, because you have your big goals that are set the strategic direction that may often come from your executive. But like I said, it should be a top-down and a bottom-up process. And when I do strategic planning, we talk about key strategies. And those are going to be the things that you as middle managers help develop and have to execute with your teams. All right? And those are the things that we also need to think about costing, because that's where the work's going to take place. All right. So I just talked about key strategies. So that's the what, the how, and the when. So when you're thinking through developing key strategy, all right, what do you propose to achieve? So you need to know what it is that you're actually aiming for. So we have the mission, we have the vision, we then have these rather high-level goals, which really often don't translate into anything. So we may say we want to grow market share by 5%. But the question then is, how do we grow market share? Okay? Your key strategy is going to tell you the how of what you want to do. So we need to make sure 2 things: that it's not pie in the sky, that it's achievable. We could be trying to grow market share by, for example, determining that we're going to bring out a new product. or that we're going to relaunch or modify an old product or service, depending on what it is you do, right? So how will you do that? What are the actions that you're going to take? You have to get very practical, particularly if you want to cost it. Because when we keep it up here at the very strategic level and actually not think about it from a practical level, we miss out on working out when we come to the budgeting how that's going to take effect, how much we're going to need. And then when is it going to happen? At what point in the fiscal year? That's really important because, as you know, there are peaks and troughs in most businesses. So, for example, if you're in tourism, you're going to have your high season and your low season. So you're going to have a time where you are, where cash flow in the business is much better than at other times. So you might want to leave big projects to those times when you know you've got better cash flow. So these are the things that you need to start working through, as I said, on a very practical level, right? So what? Why is it important? Well, it helps you further the priorities of the government or your corporation, and the objectives in terms of their strategic goals and objectives. So it's really important for us to make sure that those key strategies are linked to the organization's goals and objectives. If you work in the public sector, they need to be linked to the policy priorities of the minister. Too often when I do strategic planning, particularly within a government setting, what you get is the minister comes up with his policy. All granted, they're not always beautifully articulated and you have to work out what it is they really actually want. I understand that. But your job is, especially, is to understand what it is they're aiming for, right? However, it's presented, and then to actually give a strategy for how you're going to achieve it. And it's really important to do that. Too often what I see is, okay, the minister said he wants this, I'm going to do this. And we ignore it, and that's when we get the conflict, yeah, of the minister saying, you're not doing what I asked you to, and all the rest of it. So we need to try and make sure there's some alignment in terms of policy. And the same with your corporate strategy. If you are, if your CEO has got on a particular theme and direction, and the executive have set a direction and strategic goals, if you are now as a middle manager doing something that doesn't align with those, that isn't actually going to, take that forward and progress it, then we're off track. And we need to be able to make sure that we're adding value by going back and saying, okay, how is this activity that I'm doing matching up and aligning with and going to bring to fruition what they're after? Okay? All right. So, performance indicators. It's really important to understand what we call the results chain. When you're developing performance indicators. So input indicators, so if it talks about the economy. So input indicators can be things like how much raw material you're using if you're in production or if you do processing. It can be number of man hours, those kinds of things. They're not great measures in terms of achieving a goal. They're not very strategic because I put 60 man hours into something, or I run my machinery, and produce, X amount of, I have X tons of, steel or whatever it is going into the article that I make. That doesn't really tell me anything about whether I'm achieving my goal, no? So input measures are not particularly helpful. And often at the macro level, we look at input indicators, GDP, those kinds of things. But they're not particularly helpful to actually tell us whether we're actually tracking and achieving our strategic aims. The next thing is the activity. So I might have processed or had in X amount, like I said, of raw material, whatever it is. And then the activity may have been that we were able to produce, that we were able to have X amount of man hours working on that to get that to the state of the product that we wanted. Again, that activity doesn't tell me anything particularly. It's helpful from a productivity measure. Okay, and we spend in the Caribbean an inordinate amount of time on measuring productivity. So this input activity level. I'm going to suggest to you that we really need to move from that. Okay, productivity measures, measuring activity. So if I'm in the training function, how many courses did I do? That's a kind of productivity measure. That doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell me whether my people were engaged. It doesn't tell me if they learned anything. It doesn't tell me if it's changed their behavior. It just tells me that I ran X amount of courses. So we have to move away from that idea if we actually want to start seeing the things that we're actually trying to achieve come to pass. So then output indicators. Now, output indicators are about those things that I just talked about: effectiveness, about whether or not people were engaged, whether they learned something, behavior change, that kind of thing. It's the output level, which is often difficult to measure, but is the level at which we want to start trying to track. And when you're developing your key performance indicators for your strategy, that's the level at which you want to try and track. And then the outcome indicators, and this is particularly important if you're working in government, outcome indicators are critical. They are not things that happen overnight. They could be 5, 10 years or whatever, but they are the long-term result of the inputs, activity, and the outputs that you're doing. And your policy priorities that your governments, if they articulate policy priorities, those should have outcome measures. That's effectively what your policy priorities are. And therefore, you know what it is that when you're looking at your key performance indicators, which are output indicators, that you're trying to achieve. Yeah? So the results chain is quite important in terms of thinking through what is it I'm measuring, and is that measurement adding value? Otherwise, we're just kind of wasting our time. So key performance indicators. As I said, if we're moving to looking at output measures, an output is something that is produced by the program or the activity that we do, rather than measuring the activity itself. Okay? Output indicators show the quantity of goods or services produced by that program or activity. So I might have produced X amount of widgets, or whatever the case may be, or serviced X amount of people, but we still want to go beyond that to just measuring. We want to try and measure, what's the change, the step change that happened. And that's very much where you start moving into the outcome piece. It provides insight into the program or your operations, because it gives us a much clearer idea of all the time and the raw materials, whether it's man hours or raw materials that we're putting in. It helps us to actually see what we're getting out at the end of it. And again, when we start costing, it helps us to see whether it's worth the amount of time we're spending. Yeah. It also helps us to understand the workload and the demand for service. Okay. And it can be an efficiency measure, so processing times and things like that. This is important for us to have as an indicator to hit, but also when we look back to review, like I said, whether some of the activities that we're doing are actually worth us doing it. Because if it costs us more to achieve that, then we maybe need to look back and say, okay, we're measuring the wrong things, or we're doing the wrong things. Yeah? So we don't blindly follow the key performance indicators. So in terms of consideration of what you need to consider to develop your indicators, they should provide input and insight into your critical operations. Yeah, those things that you actually must do, those things that are core to your business. If we're measuring stuff that's not core to our business, again, it's a waste of our time. Because if it's not core, that's not what we're trying to hit. Yeah? And if it's not core, then it's unlikely to match with the key, take us very much further on our key strategies and that ultimate strategic goal or policy that our organization has. They should be smart, okay? Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. We don't want indicators that are so long that we can't track when we expect them to come to fruition. And they need to be sustained over time. So we should have a baseline to know what we've moved from and where we moved to. And that then should be something that you can then put out in the public domain in your annual reports, or for government, it goes in your budget speech, that kind of thing. In terms of making a key indicator, consider about who benefits from the outputs and ask what would success look like for them. Similarly, consider your boss or the minister or whoever heads your department. How would they measure success? Does that indicator provide enough information to direct a shift in resources? Again, what we're trying to do is not just measure activity. We're trying to measure, are we achieving en route to our destination, on our roadmap? So that's why we want to know what success looks like for key stakeholders. When we know that, then that's what we start measuring in terms of key performance indicators, right? And again, consider how the public or the customer would see success, because that's how we're going to be measured, yeah? So we come to aligning the budget. And as we've talked about, if we don't have money to walk out the strategies that we've put in place, then we're not going anywhere. So it's really important for us to align the budget. And your budget is how you get that plan implemented. So your plan must link, as I said before, to the policy priorities or your corporate strategic themes, and you need to test that. So when you develop a key strategy, you need to kind of do the cascade. Go not only come down and say, okay, my organization talked about wanting X% growth. I might be in the marketing function. Then how am I going to help contribute to that growth, And you need to, what activities I'm going to do, what kind of campaigns. They may have said, okay, that growth is going to come from a new product. What campaigns am I going to launch? How often am I going to run them? And as you come down the chain, you start to see whether your activities will actually materialize that mission, vision, and the strategic goals and intent, or the policy. And you need then to cost it. Because the other part is, when we cost it, we have to ask ourselves, for 5% growth, it's going to cost us X million. Is that going to be really worth it just to achieve that amount of growth? Yeah? Every new spend, what you would call a new spend request, so where you're going to say, okay, this is a new activity we want to do, if you're in a corporate space, how much is it going to cost us to do it? You need to make sure that those items are linked to the plan. It's very difficult to convince, especially in a climate where we're all trying to do more with less. It's very difficult to try and convince a CEO or the senior management, the executive, or your PS or whatever, that I need more money. Your budget is usually set. You're usually given a specific budget that comes down with ceilings, and then it's like work within that. So if you're going to go out on a limb and say, I need more money, you better have something really serious that you can prove and show is going to track to the strategic plan and to the goals, and know that you can actually get it done within the time frame that you said you're going to get it done in. Yeah? You need to think about future years and their costs. We often might start an initiative, and we don't think about how much money it's going to cost us to run that initiative for the long term. So let me give you a classic example, particularly from the public sector. I've worked with organizations where, okay, they recognize that they needed to build a new hospital, for example. So you budget for that, and your budget might be a rolling budget. So you may set a budget, and it's not for this year. It might be a rolling budget that goes for 3 years hence, right? And when you costed that, we left out the maintenance of the hospital. So we left out the increase in electricity, we left out the equipment maintenance and all of that going forward, right? So that's what the department did. So by the time I came in, we had this beautiful, and we've seen it across the region, this beautiful new hospital that they can't operate because nobody put the costs in for the onward going costs, right? So really important that we ensure that we put the cost on, think through the ongoing costs. So determining what the strategy costs. Will it require new resources? Before you just automatically say yes, think about the resources that you currently have, both people and equipment, and think about whether or not internally, if you did some rearranging, can you get that thing implemented without having to try and use, more budget or ask for new spend. If you can do that, ask yourself what other kinds of resources. People, estimate your people costs, right? Based on, doing the same or similar work. Can you change and build out some of the role of people, or of your current team? One of the big things that we're often challenged with, like I said, in this time, companies are trying to do more with less, and that includes people. Before we used to have these job descriptions where you listed a whole set of responsibilities, and people were, this is what I do. That's changed. What we say now is that we want you to show up with a skill set of competencies, and when you do, you deploy them however within the organization. So we no longer have to write on the job descriptions and any other things that you've been asked to do or the organization requires, yes? Which means that we have to be flexible and we have to be able to be agile, which is a big thing that we see in organizations now, in terms about our resources, and that includes our human resources. So equipment, capital, can we use equipment from another project to be able to achieve the same result or to achieve this new strategy? Can we use it from different departments? So I'll give you an example. And again, a lot of these are public sector examples because these are the most recent things that I've done. We were looking at working with disaster management organizations. And one of the things that they're trying to do is to actually predict and have better predictive data regarding disasters, where they're going to fall, and measuring the costs for that. And so they use particular technology in order to do that. Now, rather than disaster management agencies trying to buy that technology, what they ended up doing is we realized that that technology is available in the planning department. So why not share the resource instead of them now trying to put in their budget to get that same thing? So we have to get a bit more creative around the resources, and especially in terms of making sure that we are fully utilizing the budget that we have as an organization versus keeping everything in silos. When are the resources required? Startup, operational, and wind down. Again, that fits with, remember we talked about that you have seasonal times within your organization, so you need to know when these resources need to kick in so that you can properly cost and plan for it and don't get to that stage in the year and realize, oh my gosh, I don't have enough money. So the budget is not just an accounting exercise. Too often, the budget is set and almost divorced from any knowledge or reality of the strategic plan. That's not good budgeting. They're one and the same. Remember, we talked about that process at the beginning. They're one and the same. It's how your government or your corporation implements its priorities. So therefore, your budget must align with your strategy. And it's generally considered to be the most important activity for an organization because money is a finite resource. Okay? The budget is a plan to spend that money, so plan wisely. Thank you.